You can start in 5-10 seconds, Ajay.
Okay. Good evening. On behalf of the Founding Fuel team, a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us at this Founding Fuel Masterclass on the world in 2022. My name is Indrajit Gupta, and I'm co-founder at Founding Fuel. I'd like to first welcome and introduce our amazing panel. They join us from 4 different corners of the world. I'll start with Kanti Bajpai, who joins us from his base at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Hello, Kanti.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening to you. Kanti, of course, is a strategic affairs expert and has published many books. But behind him, you'll see his latest book, India versus China, Why They Can't Be Friends. I hope I got the title right.
You did.
Okay, lovely to have you, Kanti. Viral Acharya joins us from New York City. Hello, Viral.
Hello, hi everyone.
Viral teaches at the Stern School at NYU, highly respected economist, and also has served as Deputy Governor of the RBI between 2017 and 2019. And I'd realized that he has quite a heavy, big fan following, because as soon as we announced his name, many of his alums from IIT Bombay, some juniors, some of his own batchmates, they were very excited because obviously they follow a lot of what he says because it matters. And I also realized in his CV that he teaches a very interesting course on business, economy, and policy in the midst of COVID-19. I wish I could be in that class as well. Sounded like a very interesting course outline. All of you should check it out when you get time. It's there on his site. Hi, Nick.
Hello.
Hi. So Nick Parker is based in Toronto. Nick was responsible for coining the term Cleantech. And if sustainability is one of our hot button issues in these times, I think Nick is approaching it from an entrepreneurial and a investment lens. So therefore, I think we're going to hear some fairly interesting perspectives on what he's seeing that's in the innovation pipeline, so to say. And what's interesting is that he has a deep connection with India as well. He was telling me that his mother was born here and his father served in the Indian Army. I hope that I got that right, Nick.
And my son is a tabla player. And
Wow.
it so happens that one of the people on this panel, I'm celebrating the 40th anniversary of knowing him today, and I'll reveal that later.
Okay, okay, we'll come to him in just a sec, and that's Sundeep Waslekar. Hi, Sundeep.
Hi.
So he's of course a familiar name for the Founding Fuel community. He's appeared on our shows and for a while. And in fact, he and I did a quarterly podcast on the world in 2021, which if you haven't had a chance to listen to, you should, because it just picks up some of the most important events around the world every quarter and also pitches it forward in terms of what to expect. So Sundeep is the president of Strategic Foresight. It's a think tank that advises governments. And he has the envious task of traveling around the world, except that for the last, I think, almost 20 months, Sundeep was grounded thanks to COVID in his apartment in Warsaw and Bombay. But if I recall correctly, Sundeep, you started traveling again October this year to Europe. So great. So great to have you, Sundeep. This is our second edition of this masterclass. World in 2021 was our first. And often people ask us, why do you plan this conversation? What's the purpose? And we say that, look, it's very simple. The world is getting more complex, more uncertain, more ambiguous. And this exercise, which is really an exercise in sense making, we're guessing will be useful for all leaders, because the world is today interconnected, like it or not. We're going to rely on the domain knowledge and the wisdom that exists in this panel to really listen, learn, understand, and hopefully distill some of the things that we ought to appreciate and know about. Obviously, given the fact that it's a 90-minute session, we will not be able to cover everything under the sun or all the important themes. So we've chosen 4 different but interrelated themes, which we'll come to. And we've requested each of our panelists to lead one of these themes, right? And then the others can then be part of that conversation and we'll draw them in. The whole idea is to keep this masterclass interactive. My colleague and co-founder, Charles Assisi, is anchoring the chat on the YouTube live stream. So as this conversation rolls on, we'd request you to, as the audience, to share your questions and comments, and Charles will pick up a few and share it with me, and we'll ask the panel to respond. So that's it. We should get started. But before we jump into the 4 themes of 2022, I thought it'd be a good idea to just do a quick recap or a review and take stock of what really happened in 2021. And we're going to ask our panel, each of them, the panelists, to pick one defining story that they felt was important in 2021 and all that happened in this year. So I'll start with you, Kanti, if that's okay. You want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for having me on this. My head was buzzing with, and I listed 12 things that I noticed in 2021, but I'm not going to list them, obviously. And you tasked me with looking at the rise of Asia segment of, well, I hope I haven't given away part of the game of the 4 areas. But I'm going to pick one that I guess doesn't quite fit in my area. I think the defining story of 2021 is probably the vaccination story. Overall, the vaccination started in about January or February, and I think that really, right up to this moment, with Omicron and all of that, it's still the vaccination breakthrough. It's quite an amazing thing that in just over a year, several companies and countries put together different vaccines of different kinds, and they really kind of gave us hope that both in terms of our health, as well as the health of the global economy and individual economies, there might be a way out of this pandemic faster than we thought. And so I would say, for me, that's the biggest story of 2021. I mean, there are all kinds of other contenders, and I think right at the end, despite Omicron, somewhat related is the breakthrough on antiviral pills. So I think the medical story around the pandemic, the kind of possibilities of seeing this pandemic out or managing it better at any rate, I think that's probably, for me, the story of 2021.
It's interesting, Kanti, that you mentioned the global collaboration or cooperation really to produce the vaccine. Of course, there's been some disquiet about inequities in distribution and access, but we'll, I guess, come to that in a bit, because that has implications as well for the world in which we're moving into. But thanks for that. That was great. Kanti, would you like to, Viral, would you like to kind of share your most defining story?
Yes, thank you, IG. I'll stick to economics. For me, the defining story has been inflation over the last year. In spite of the hopes of most central bankers, policymakers, companies, etc., the rise in prices has not been transitory. They were all hoping that it'll be a blip. All kinds of terms were invented, bullwhip, and all that sort, to say that you're just getting whipped and it's going to come down soon after the whip is over. But wherever you look around, whichever country and from whichever product angle, whether it's goods, whether it's services, whether it's fuel, I think it's been hard to get inflation to be high over the last 40 years. And to me, it is astonishing that a health shock such as COVID would in the end manage to engineer something that the central banks tried so hard over the last 10 years to engineer, which was to get the demand to sort of accelerate faster than the supply could catch up.
Right.
I'll touch upon it later that some of it has to do with unequal vaccinations around the world. But I think it also is sending a bigger and deeper message, in my view, about how the developed economy policies and growth spectrum are now becoming somewhat comparable to what used to be emerging markets. So I'm going to suggest that the reason why I think inflation might be a defining moment of the last year as far as economics is concerned, because perhaps it signals that developed economies might be gradually sliding down the path that we usually used to associate with emerging markets. And I'll try and explain that.
That's very, very interesting. That's very interesting. So inflation as and in the manner that it's hurt, I think, communities, people, individuals, and made things a lot more difficult for governments as well, because that can kind of be a political hot potato to deal with as well. We know that. So great, we'll definitely pick that up. Nick, do you want to kind of come in with your story of 2021?
Yeah, as you might expect, I'll come in from the decarbonization standpoint. And it's pretty hard to deny that is a contender for theme of the year. But the decarbonization story is not quite, perhaps for me, the way others would see it. I see that in 2021, the 21st year of our 21st century, that the light bulb went off for humanity in two, if not three ways. One, that we're, for lack of a better term, in deep shit. We, despite heroic efforts, are heading over the cliff. We've managed to slow ourselves down. We've managed to swerve a little bit, but we're still heading over the cliff collectively. And that climate is actually not the issue. It's merely a symptom of an issue. The second dimension of that is that there's a race now on to decarbonize. And that is in large part because of the economic upside from doing so and the risks of not doing so. So it's not really about what goes on in Glasgow. It's about cost curves, financial allocation, market incentives, and all the rest.
Great. No, this is anyways is one of our themes in this conversation, because as we can see, a lot of these will continue into next year and beyond. So great that you surfaced your perspective on decarbonization, which is very interesting. Sandeep, coming to you. Invariably, you'll have something surprising, which we wouldn't expect. What is it?
Thank you, IG, and I'm very glad I'm following Nick very directly.
Okay.
My sense is that the world entered a paradox in 2021, and it's a paradox which has resulted from contradiction between geopolitics and climate politics. So, if you look at the world from geopolitical point of view, there is a hostility between the United States and China and their respective allies. If you look at the world from geopolitical point of view, there is an effort to or aspiration to decouple China from the world economy or Western economy. But if you look at the world from a climate political point of view, there is the beginning of extremely strong integration of China in the Western economies. Because United States, Europe, and other countries, they have committed to decarbonize, as Nick said, and go carbon neutral by 2050. And how do they do that? By introducing solar energy, wind energy, electric vehicles, and technologies of this nature. And it's China which is producing most of the raw material and intermediate goods for this sector. So if you want to decarbonize, if you want to play your climate politics well, you have to depend on China, and you have to grow your economy in conjunction with China, which is paradoxical to your geopolitical aspirations. And if I may say just one thing, what it means for India is that when it comes to geopolitics, India is on the side of the United States. But when it comes to climate politics, India is teaming up with China, as we saw in Glasgow, as we saw in United Nations Security Council just 2 days ago. And before signing up, I would say that while we are looking at US and China, let's not forget Russia. The hostility between US and Russia is as strong as the expected hostility between US and China. I'll rest there.
Sure. Thanks, Sandeep. You've obviously, as always, set the cat among the pigeons. It kind of, so there are 4 themes that have emerged. Just to kind of summarize, I think Kanti spoke about the vaccination story, which he thought was very powerful, an example of global collaboration, if I may say so. Viral has kind of sounded a warning in terms of inflation being a big story that's still playing out, and how do we kind of harness it and bring it under control. That's got many central bankers perplexed. Decarbonization and a whole new lens at it, of looking at it from Nick. And Sandeep, you've talked about something which we ought to unpack in the first segment itself, which is the whole tussle between the US and China, which we started to see, because there was a lot of hope in 2021 around when we looked at the Masterclass with the arrival of President Biden, that things might actually tamp down in terms of tensions between the two. But that hasn't quite happened. In fact, if anything, the tensions are growing. So, I mean, if we can jump into the first segment, Sandeep, which you were meant to lead, drawing from what you just described, which is the paradox between the geopolitics and climate change and China's role in that. Can we just widen that a bit and look at the larger conflict, or the new Cold War, as you describe it, between US and China? And then we'll go to each of the panelists, maybe specifically Kanti, and then Viral and Nick as well.
No, Indrajit, let's not forget that there is also the old Cold War re-emerging between US and Russia. So while we talk about US and China, we should constantly keep in mind the re-emergence of Cold War between US and Russia. So what you have now is a trilateral conflict between US, Russia, China. And at times, Russia will play China against the US. At times, China will play Russia against the US, and Russia and US is opposed to both. So this is what has already started. And every party is trying to woo India. So India is a bit like a beauty queen for the time being, as we recently saw from President Putin's visit and his proposal that there should be a trilateral dialogue between Russia, China, and in India. But what we are saying is a lot of talk about the risk of war. I personally don't think that's on the anvil, not for the 2022, the period we are looking at, or not for the next few years at least. But a lot of psychological war will take place as troop movements are taking place on the border near Ukraine, and the Chinese aircrafts are approaching the air zone of Taiwan very, very closely, just on the border of the Taiwanese air zone. So a lot of movements will take place, a lot of tension, a lot of brinksmanship that will happen. But where there is another dimension where the conflict will emerge between US and China, particularly in the next year and in the years to come, and that's in the outer space. Space is going to be the new theater of competition. The International Space Station is retiring in 2024, unless the US Congress decides to extend its life till 2030. The Chinese space station had just been built, and Chinese are going to be ruling that space station for quite a while. And they have already indicated that they will take the Russian cooperation in running the station. You have all kinds of weapons being tried using space as the main theater. There is a hypersonic missiles race which is taking place. Really, this last 2 years, if you ask me what were the defining characteristics, there were 3. One was the COVID crisis, second was the climate crisis, and third were the conflict engineered by the race over hypersonic missiles. You have missile shield being built by the Americans. You have anti-satellite weapons being tried by all the parties. India is trying to enter into this race as well. So outer space is going to be weaponized. And if a war takes place, really, it will not be in Taiwan, it will not be in Ukraine, but it will be in the outer space, in the lower geosynchronous orbit, to be certain. So that's where there is a risk in the next few years. So what is at stake is not only the Earth, but also the space.
Right. If I were to just kind of build on that, Sundeep, what we've seen the US try and do is to try and kind of divide the world into two camps. People who believe in democratic values and democracy, and those who don't. And obviously, China and some of the others fall into that bracket. How do you see this playing out? I mean, is this something that the US will be able to kind of carve out their space and kind of bind China in that sense?
Well, the US can wish whatever it wants, and the Chinese can wish whatever they want. And finally, the world will judge by their action, not by what they say. So the US convened this big democracy summit, which was limited to democracies like Pakistan. So if that is the concept of democracy, we don't have to take this democracy summit very seriously, or even the overall attempt to divide the word in the democratic camps, and in the two camps as democracies and non-democracies. But what is happening, which is quite interesting, is that while the US is promoting hostility with the Russians and Chinese, and not and also, of course, the Russians and Chinese promoting the hostility with the US on their own, US and Russia have entered into stability talks to constrain the use of nuclear weapons, hypersonic missiles, and other deadly weapons. So you have strategic stability talks taking place between US and Russia. And US and China are looking at starting of strategic stability talks, also to put restraint on the use of the really deadly weapons. So US is very happily talking about autocracies and engaging into strategic stability talks with them, while US asks Europeans to be antagonistic to the Russians, and US asks India, Japan, and Australia to be antagonistic to the Chinese and sells them missiles, not to mention nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, while US itself wants to have strategic stability talks with China and also with Russia. So what these superpowers do, we have to read a little bit in between the lines. And the same goes with what the Chinese are doing and what the Russians are doing.
Right. I'll just bring in Sundeep, Kanti here. Kanti, I know you have a slightly different point of view on the role that Russia is kind of likely to play in this equation, because they don't have necessarily the same economic heft as the other two. How are you seeing this game develop from your perspective?
I think, a lot of what Sundeep has said makes a lot of sense. I do think Russia has been undervalued or neglected in the kind of larger strategic picture, and it's increasingly over the last 10 years or so shown that it's very capable of intruding into what otherwise looks like a bipolar setup increasingly, and in Eastern Europe, but much further afield. I mean, the Russians now are players that others look to for peacemaking, in oil politics, and even in terms of arms sales and so on and so forth. So I think the Russia in a sense is back. And I forwarded an article to you that I read recently about how there's really quite a lot of continuity in Russian policy since Primakov, right up through Putin, which is to bring Russia back. And to use, some traditional levers of power, which are Russia's first-rate military technology, but also very much to use asymmetric means. I think even more than China, it's Russia that has really pioneered gray zone tactics and influence peddling and that whole bag of tricks of asymmetric competition, from influencing elections in the West to all kinds of other things. So I think, it is interesting that Russia is back. And A lot of people discounted Russia. Its demography was going the wrong way. Its economy was going the wrong way. It only had commodities, and even its arms industry looked a bit kind of shop worn, and so on and so forth. I think the Russians have really come back. So I guess I wouldn't say it's quite a triangular relationship between the three. One of the clearly the Russians are more on the Chinese side, though I take Sundeep's point that they sometimes do use the Americans to send out a tacit warning to the Chinese that they could defect the other way. But for China, what's nice is that the Russians have provided a kind of continental backstop. The Chinese, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, were basically a continental power. They don't need to look that far into the continent now, with the Russians being a kind of junior partner. And they can turn their attention, which they haven't since Cheng He in the 15th century or whatever it was, to the maritime area and the problems with in the South China Sea with Japan, and of course primarily with the United States. So Russia has a great importance for Asia, and I think Asia is beginning to wake up to that.
Right. That's very interesting. I wanted to come to Viral essentially also because the economic story that parred China to the top of the heap in some ways in the last 2 decades, there is some disquiet that might kind of unwind or unravel given the nature of their economic model. How do you see that? Because there's always, whatever you say about China, the opposite is also sometimes true. Is there really something serious that we need to worry about the Chinese economy per se? Are they deliberately slowing down?
I think I would say there are at least 3 things to keep in mind. The first point I would highlight is, and I like the way Sundeep sort of set it up as a paradox, because I think there's also a paradox on that in the inflation front, which I touched upon earlier, which is that for the longest time, the United States consumers have actually enjoyed extremely low prices of almost anything. And that is really because of China. It's because of China's growth over the last 3 to 4 decades, where it became the world's manufacturing hub. And in a way that allowed the United States to focus on essentially diverting its human capital towards sort of, the more high-end value add in technology, R&D, innovation, etc. Which in turn kept the digital services at a lower cost. In some sense, I think this message has not been sent. I think the world looks at China pretty much with a very sort of negative mindset, at least the parts of the world that we reside in. And there are good reasons for that. There are issues about the way it's organized, the way its processes work, the way it's working geopolitically that may not necessarily be the ones we want to agree with. But on an objective front, there is a big consumer surplus that China has generated for the rest of the world, which is that it has kept prices at an astonishingly low level for the longest stretch of time that one can imagine. And I think this decoupling with China that is happening either for jobs or geopolitical or, I would say sort of, the global hegemony, if you want to call who wants to be where in that space, is partly going to have serious implications, in my view, for the global supply chains. The global supply chains evolve as a very complex network over small corporate decisions that accumulate into a very complex web of how intermediate goods are getting used to produce the next round of value-added products and so on. And these have evolved now across countries for 4 decades. And there is now a sort of global consensus that both from a diversification of supply chains as well as these geopolitical considerations, we need to decouple or move away from China. We need to reduce China's role in all of this. And I think one has to realize that this adjustment, this transition, everyone's talking about transition risk on climate, but there is another transition risk one has to worry about, which is transitioning away from China. And that this is not going to be easy. It's going to also be something that corporates will not necessarily embrace fully, just the way corporates will not want to embrace every aspect of climate change, because privately it's not going to be necessarily the least cost production for them. How do corporates compete for their client base? They want to sell cheaper products of similar quality, and that's how they ensure that customers stay with them. So I think there are deeper implications here for inflation and prices of goods that we have got used to at very, very low rates. And I would add a second point here in that vein, which is that this low inflation has also allowed interest rates and costs of borrowing in developed economies to be at extraordinarily low levels over the last 3 decades. And as inflation rises because of these supply chain issues, I think we've got to accept that borrowing costs for companies may have to rise, as literally yesterday the Fed and today Bank of England have signaled to us that they plan to raise rates in order to rein in demand, in order to bring inflation down, not just at consumer prices, but also at producer prices. So I think this is a big shift happening in my view, where the unloading of China onto the global space produced massive compression of prices, which allowed the world to engage in a massive debt binge over the last 3 decades because of extraordinarily low rates. And all this, in my view, is now going to face rising interest rates going forward. I think we have to wait and see if the adjustment of corporates and governments to their high levels of debt as interest rates rise is going to be smooth. We know that when the housing debt came to a screeching halt, it didn't play out particularly well about 15 years back. So that's my second point, which is that I think this decoupling from China has deep economic consequences for inflation, costs of borrowing, and what it means for the mountain loads of debt that developed economies and their companies have taken on. And the third point I would add here, this is a point that really goes back to Charles Goodhart and Manoj Pradhan, who've written this book on inflation. They make a very interesting point, and you touched upon this, that China in its own life cycle is also moving away from creating growth primarily through infrastructure investments, manufacturing, capacity expansion on those fronts, to actually building its own consumption engine, its services engines, and so on. There's also a demographic aspect to this as well, which is that they cannot keep supplying labor the way they were over the last 3 to 4 decades. And their point is that all of these dynamics themselves mean that labor in the developed economies is going to get its bargaining power back. Right. Why did labor lose its bargaining power in the manufacturing sector in developed economies? It's because if the labor demanded anything in the West, all that happened was that industry moved to somewhere in Southeast Asia, most notably China, but also other parts of Southeast Asia. And there's a sense that this decoupling, the transition that's happening in China itself, the labor demographics there, all of these may also put upward pressure on inflation in the coming years. And so I think we are at very interesting crossroads, in my view. What we used to take for granted as sort of low costs of goods, low inflation, low borrowing costs for 3 to 4 decades, maybe that's finally coming to an end. This will have implications for growth. This will have implications for whether the developed economies are going to remain agile in ensuring that they have newer engines of growth. Sure. Or will they just keep throwing money at the problem by printing more and more money and hoping that demand can actually take them out of it? If there's time, I want to come back to this last theme a little bit more. But that's where I see things heading between the geopolitics, transitions in China, inflation, and the potential debt rollover problem for large advanced economies.
Terrific. That's a very interesting tapestry of issues and implications, which we should try and unpack in your segment as well on the global economic recovery, because a lot of this is tied to that, I'm guessing, as well. I wanted to just end this segment with a question to Nick. Nick, one of the other dimensions of this US-China tussle has been on technology and the tech battles that have played out. Chinese big digital firms being blocked out, access and IP issues coming up, and it's been a fierce battle in some ways. How are you seeing it? Because you have one leg in the tech space very clearly. You want to kind of help us see what's likely to happen next?
Well, I think, so much of this is about how we frame the conversation and what gets our attention. And many of the things that have been shared so far are absolutely the things that get our attention, like inflation and the potential for conflict. But I think there's a deeper transition or transformation underway that is not obvious to many of us. So, for example, the notion of eco-civilization is taken very seriously in China from within the academy, within the People's Bank of China, within the sort of the gates of within the Forbidden City and so on. And the Chinese are thinking through not how can we solve each problem on its own in isolation, but how do we take a systems-based approach? And I think this is very, very important because clearly the way we're addressing many of our issues is not working wherever we are in the world. And the conflict between ecology, which is the substrate of economy, and actually the same root word, is not working, and the very substrate is sort of falling away. So the Chinese are trying to address this, and I think this provides an opportunity for dialogue with them. So, for example, take the area like AI, artificial intelligence. We see that as an area of competition and an area of conflict between them and us, and whoever wins that game wins the 21st century economy. At the same time, AI can be used for up to 10% of carbon emissions. That's a latest report from the Boston Consulting Group. The Chinese are reaching out to Canada, Singapore, Chile, and other countries to cooperate on using artificial intelligence. And of course, they've got the data sets. So I think there's below the surface, there are areas of commercial cooperation and public sector cooperation around new technology. And I would throw blockchain and many of these other areas that the Chinese are interested in collaborating with foreign partners about. And indeed, in my space, there's a lot of deal making going on. Just nobody's talking about it for obvious reasons.
Right. Thanks so much, Nick, on that. Kanti, there's a question that's come in. I thought maybe you can take that and we can head into the next segment after that. So we'll keep it very tight. K. Ramkumar, who's a contributor at Founding Fuel, he's asking, is China establishing geopolitical leverage using its economic leverage? And what is the likelihood that they're colonizing strategic hotspots by trapping these countries into a debt trap? Or is Xi destroying this leverage by brinkmanship and overreaching? What's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still a bit of an open question, but and the Chinese are happy to leave a degree of ambiguity out there. Are they, spreading their wealth, investing, building infrastructure, and all of that because they truly believe in, kind of a global economic recovery built on those kinds of projects and funding? Is it because they've got, surplus capacity, which would be better shoved out there to get better returns for themselves? Or is there a kind of larger geopolitical game of influence buying and so on as part of a new Cold War? And, the Americans have 100 bases all over the world or something. The Chinese are going to do it differently. They're going to buy their quasi-allies and so on. And they might build some bases as well here and there. So, I mean, I think we haven't quite got the story. We'll probably never quite know, and the Chinese themselves may not know, because I think there are different agencies and groups doing various things for slightly different reasons, and I'm not quite sure that Xi Jinping is always has got this massive game plan that he's completely in charge of. Are they overextending? I mean, I think they could be, in fact, and there's quite a bit of evidence that that might be the case. I mean, we've had visits in Singapore from people who helped run the BRI, for instance. These are people from the PLA and elsewhere in influential places. And at least 2 years ago, they already indicated that they were worried about the overextension of the BRI, projects that were going nowhere, and that they would have to pull back. They also very candidly said that they have their own public opinion, which expresses itself in molecular and perhaps not so very transparent ways, but in effective ways to them. And that opinion expresses itself as, why are we giving away all our funds to all these other countries? We've still got stuff to fix at home, welfare and so on and so forth. So I mean, I think that there is at home also some disquiet. And just my last point on China, I mean, sometimes when I look, and maybe let me just be a little playful about it, but half serious too, which is the more Xi Jinping garners all this power for himself and elects himself leader in perpetuity and so on, and centralizes, the more I begin to scratch my head and ask, if everything's going so hunky-dory, and the Chinese juggernaut is ineluctably going to roll forward, then why does he need to do all that, actually? And I've got a sneaking feeling that he knows a lot about some great vulnerabilities and difficulties the Chinese have coming down the road. I'm not an economist, Viral and others will speak to that, but I am worried about that. And if the Chinese juggernaut doesn't roll economically, that's not necessarily good news for the rest of us. So let me stop there. Yeah. Sure.
No, that's something that we'd have to keep our eyes peeled on. I think next year for sure, because this kind of takes us into the next theme, which is really around Asia, because we felt that, especially given the battle between the US and China and Russia as well, in some ways, clearly Asia is emerging as the next battleground, not just from a military and security standpoint, but also that's where the growth of the world is really coming from, the economic growth. So I wanted Kanti to kind of help us understand what shape the story might take in going forward in the next year and beyond, and what should we be looking out for?
Okay, very good. So I'll try and be as crisp as possible. I'll make 3 points. The first is really to question whether Asia is kind of rising and such an engine of growth, and is it such a big deal? I mean, notice that the United States plus the EU, their combined GDPs is $35 trillion. And China plus Japan are barely 20 trillion. The rest are relatively small beans. So Asia, is still quite a way behind the combined West, frankly. But when we say Asia is rising, who's rising? I mean, of course, it is still China. Japan and Korea are kind of spluttering and stuttering in various ways. But the one that we seem to miss sometimes in India is ASEAN, the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. ASEAN collectively has a bigger GDP than India. And it's the 6th largest in the world after the United States, China, EU, Japan, and Germany, that is collectively. It's charting rates of growth that are slightly lower than India over 20 years, from 2000 to 2019. But every country except Cambodia and Myanmar has a higher per capita income than India. These countries do better on virtually every indicator of human development, even in the poorest countries in the region, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. So there's a long-term basis for growth if you believe that you've got to get your human development right to sustain growth over the long term. And I think, we associate India with the rise of Asia. I'm kind of doubtful. And, this is Viral's area as well, but the Indian recovery, I mean, it's had the most serious decline in growth rates of any major economy in the world during COVID. Worse than the US, the EU, Germany, Japan, and Indonesia, close to home where I am. China actually grew by 2.3%. India dropped by over 7%. So, I'm not sure that in 2022, India is going to be rising very much, to be honest. It may climb back to where it was, but even that's not very certain. So that's my first point, is that Asia may be rising, but it's still got quite a long way to go to catch up with the West. And look out for ASEAN, I think. The demography there looks good. A lot of young people. It's dynamic. They're ambitious. They've got human development right. I wouldn't count on India to be a huge, driver of growth there. Second, I think if Asia is rising, it should manage its security issues. I mean, that's one connotation of what Asia rising. But I'm not sure there's all that much success there. India-China relations, the Taiwan issue, East China Sea, South China Sea, they're all, India-China stalemated. So we're not managing that too terribly well. Taiwan is getting more fractious, and the Taiwanese are looking not to the rest of Asia, but to the Americans to help out. East China Sea, that's a quarrel with Japan, and the South China Sea, they're kind of stable, and there's a code of conduct discussion between China and ASEAN, although that's been going on for about 15 years. But in the meantime, ASEAN is increasingly divided. There's the rise of what instead in Asia? The Quad, 2 partners of which are Western countries and the Indo-Pacific. There's the rise of AUKUS, Australia, UK, US. So the Western part, and the United Kingdom, France, and Germany are now sending their navies back into Asia for the first time in, 50 or 60 years. So actually, it's the big white chiefs that are coming back into rising Asia to lend security to Asians, that is, apart from China. And note also that Asia it may be rising economically, but it's not really rising militarily, except for China. There's no great military power here, including India. India's ability to project military power is very limited. It has no indigenous military capability except for missiles and nuclear weapons, basically, that it makes. Its ammunition supply would run out in 2 weeks in conventional terms. I think that's pretty well known. So, I think Asia doesn't have a major military power except China. Asia, is kind of rising. It's attracting more attention because of the Cold War, I think, between the 2 big powers. And so we'll probably come back to that. I won't say much more. But my third point is back to the economy a bit. Where Asia does seem to be doing somewhat better is on trade arrangements. I mean, I guess RCEP happened last year. CPTPP has been galvanized now by the UK and Taiwan and China wanting to join. The RCEP will come into force, I think, 1st of January 2022. So that's something to be watched for. And the combined GDP of those countries is 26 trillion. What's striking, of course, is that neither the US or India are part of either the RCEP or the CPTPP. So that part of Asia is rising without these 2 key powers that we might be interested in. By the way, India is not in APEC either.
Yes.
And India wants to renegotiate all its trade agreements with ASEAN. I really wonder, no country in Asia, including now Bangladesh, has grown without export-led growth. And India is pulling out of trade agreements or wants to renegotiate them. Good luck. It's talking about doing trade agreements with Australia, the UK, the EU, the US to compensate for taking itself out of Asia. I'm really doubtful. The EU and the US will be very difficult given their social clause kind of sensitivities, the US protectionist mood in coming up with a trade agreement with India. I don't think that trade agreements with Australia and the UK can make up for the loss of RCEP and not being in the CPTPP. So, that's just a red herring to me. And bilateral deals in Asia, I think Jagdish Bhagwati said a long time ago, about regional deals, let alone bilateral ones, you'll end up with a spaghetti bowl problem and massive transaction and information costs. So I don't think that a huge raft of bilateral deals for India is going to compensate for taking ourselves out of all these regional deals. But the rest of Asia, I think that's one area where Asia is doing relatively well. They've pulled themselves together in trade deals. India is really not part of that. So let me just conclude this section. I think Asia is rising, but it's largely China. And I think look to Southeast Asia. I wouldn't say India. Asia is still far behind the West. The China will be massive. That's quite clear. Although demography and debt, I wonder, in the long run, whether China can, sustain really high rates of growth with that problem of viral will have something to say there. I think Asia, apart from China, still looks to the West for security, to the big white chiefs. And the Cold War is coming. I'll say something about that. I think we look at it very negatively, but there may be opportunities there for Asian countries. So I'll leave you with that kind of sort of.
Great. I'll come to Viral on the economy and the trade issues, because that's going to be interesting. But first, Sundeep, do you want to kind of respond to Kanti's point about Asia and where it figures in the global scheme of things, and especially from a military perspective? Because as we just heard, and you've spoken about this before as well, the Cold War is coming to Asia.
Well, in the beginning, I thought that Kanti was being rather polite and subtle, but I was glad in the end he spoke like an academic and not like a diplomat, and he put it right there on a table, saying that we are talking about Asia, but what we actually mean is China, when you're talking about the rise of Asia. But it's really so. Thank you, Kanti, for your very direct conclusion. So I will take out from there, and I agree with Kanti that that is really what the situation on the ground is. Of course, ASEAN is important. Korea, he didn't mention Korea. Korea is important. Korea is emerging not only in terms of military technology, but also in terms of culture as a very center of influence, important center of influence. Japan is trying to regain its space, which it had in 1990s. And we don't know to what extent it will succeed or it will not. But it's really China, which is really the front line of Asia. And keeping that in mind, there are two issues. One, China is outside of your economy, military, trade, and everything else. There are two important factors which are going to determine the future of China. One, in terms of high technology, China is really way ahead. It is competing with the United States, and in some respects, it is even out-competing the United States. It's ahead of the US. For instance, China has been able to land a probe on the dark side of the moon, which nobody has been able to do. China is in an intense race, and this is very important for economy as well as for security. Is an intense race to dominate the petaflop computer market. China has the largest numbers of petaflop. For a long time, China had the #1 petaflop. Right now, it's the US, but it's kind of going back and forth between the American, Chinese, and even the Japanese. But the Chinese are really leading. China has a whole ring of petaflop computers, which allows it to do everything, right from testing, simulation testing of nuclear weapons to all kinds of high technologies that Nick was talking earlier. And China is also way advanced in the genomics and biotechnology, and it's making all kinds of experiments, some of them dangerous, like chimera between the human species and animal species. And of course, Nick already said, using artificial intelligence and blockchain in a beneficial manner. So how far China succeeds in this technological advance will determine a lot, and it might be able to get an edge despite its other weaknesses. On the other side, China has problem with resources. Nick talked about its move towards eco-civilization, but on the ground, China has serious problem with water, its rivers. Thousands of lakes in the north of China have dried up or have disappeared. The Yellow River, when I was a child and I read geography, we used to say that Yellow River was called the River of Sorrows because it would cause big floods all the time. Now, Yellow River doesn't reach the East China Sea for 100 days a year. Chinese have to think in terms of transferring water from Yangtze to Yellow River. So they have serious problems with water. If they are moving towards eco-civilization and try to rectify some of those things, that might help overcome. But what Chinese do with their environment, with their water resources, and with technology is going to determine a lot as to where they stand. And the rest of the Asia, as I said, as Kanti said, it's...
One of the things that I wanted to touch upon, which Kanti and you perhaps could kind of elucidate before we go to Viral and Nick, which is the whole, which we saw, the US pull out in Afghanistan and the instability that it has created in Asia. And it will have ripple effects, I'm guessing, as well. A lot of implications there. Do you want to kind of talk a little about that in short, and then we can move to the economy and trade issues in Asia, which are worth looking at?
Well, the US pullout from Afghanistan has created instability in Indian foreign policy calculations. I don't see it creating instability in Asia. Frankly speaking, it has created instability in the European foreign policy calculations, because this pullout from Afghanistan happened 2 months after the NATO meeting. There was a major NATO summit in June, and the Americans didn't say a word about this pullout at that time. In the declaration that was issued at the end of NATO summit, there's one small para devoted to, wishy-washy para devoted to Afghanistan. And 2 months later, the Europeans wake up in the morning and they said the Americans are withdrawing. And they were called like with their pants down. And at the same time, this AUKUS deal happened, where the Americans got the French out of the business and sold nuclear powered submarine. Not only that, they even exported or got UK to export the missiles to Australia. So the Afghanistan thing is of a regional value. I think for Pakistan, of course, it got into a dominant position, cause of reason. But I don't really think it matters a lot for Asia. That's my take. Maybe Kanti disagrees, or we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Asia means everything from Myanmar eastwards, I don't think it's had much of an effect here in East Asia. In fact, it may be a positive, because there's a bit of a feeling that the Americans were distracted by West Asia and Afghanistan far too much and weren't paying enough attention to East Asia, where the stakes are much higher. And so there's kind of a unsaid kind of positive view, which is that this might bring the Americans back into East Asia. So I think for a lot of East Asian countries, not the Chinese, but for the rest of East Asia, there's sort of a quiet comfort. They didn't care too much about Afghanistan, except that it was distracting the Americans. I think even India, I mean, India is mixed, because it does also mean that the United States may pay more attention to East Asia and keep the Chinese off balance there a bit more. So I think India is a bit divided on the American pullout as well. Yeah.
Sure. Viral, I wanted to come to you first. We spoke about RCPE at the last Masterclass as well last year, and India had chosen to stay out, and there was a lot of conversation around that. In hindsight now, what is your view about the way that RCP, what are the implications really for India and for Asia as a trading bloc? Because it was quite a large constellation of nations who joined together, and the Americans, like Kanti was saying, were kept out. China was there, Australia was there. India decided to stay out. So your views on trade?
Yeah, I'm fully with Kanti on this, and also actually one of India's former Niti Aayog chairman, Arvind Panagaria from Columbia University, that I think we have simply not evolved out of a protectionist mindset as far as trade is concerned. I think one thing I agreed amongst a very small subset of things with Donald Trump was that India is a tariff king. India basically likes to tariff the hell out of the rest of the world on every single product that it can negotiate these things on. And actually, it's much deeper than that. I think India fundamentally as a country distrusts competition. It distrusts entry. It distrusts creative destruction of incumbents, growth of newer companies, newer emerging players in any industry. Some of this has to do with the power that the top 10 to 12 industrialists have in the country over public policy making. They can very easily dial up the phone and say, I don't like this particular company coming into India, do something about it. Of course, that's not how the conversation is going to be cast. The conversation is going to be cast around local jobs and so on. And you can see that with all the right intent, the names of all the programs on India's growth is about we are going to do it. It's never about making it clear that we cannot grow, as Kanti said, just through our domestic consumption. We need to produce and supply goods for the rest of the world so that we are actually creating jobs and partaking in the global wealth development. So I see this, the way we are dealing with RCEP and others, the way we are trying to renegotiate every single trade, etc. I see this as a part of a very long pattern of India basically just trying to tariff the hell out of the rest of the world. It's actually quite sad what it does for the domestic industry. It creates an artificial ring of protection for them. They are never made to compete. And as a result, Indian companies, barring a few, don't produce world-class goods because they are domestically protected from competition in one form or the other. Even when we say we are open, we are never really open because the tariffs we charge on anything that's coming in is so high. What it means is, and it's there, it's evident. You can see it even in the macro data on India. Every time Indian consumption picks up, every time India's growth picks up, India basically becomes a net importer because we immediately have to consume goods that the rest of the world is producing because our companies do not produce at the high end what the country consumes. We have basically become reliant on that for the rest of the world. And it's because we have created this artificial veil through tariff policies for our companies so that they remain nicely mollycoddled. Internally, they look great. Everyone thinks these are national champions. They are beautiful brands that we should be very proud of. But the truth is, they are not producing anything of world class that anyone else in the rest of the world wants to come and buy. I think we have to get out of this mindset. I don't know what it will take for India to come out of this mindset, because the fear I have is that we can see India is sort of always, like, as they say, like everything that's true for India, the opposite is also true. So we are never growing very fast, but we are never also falling off the cliff.
Right.
And in a way, what is not so great about us is that we kind of remain in this zone of mediocre growth for long stretches, and nothing shakes up the system because it's not so bad that you have to do something dramatic about it. The only time we did it was in 1991, where we did something dramatic about it because we actually reached the point of a crisis. Nor do we actually power, as China did for like 3 decades in a row, like keep growing at close to 10% growth rate with a clear plan. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a bit frustrating, India's trade policy. I think it's very regressive. It's very protectionist. And I think it's killing the domestic productivity.
I'm just kind of conscious of the time because we have 2 more segments to cover. So, Nick, I'll just come to you for a brief response to the other side of the coin, which I think Viral was talking about, which is entrepreneurship. You're looking at Asia also as probably a hotspot of entrepreneurship and innovation because you're investing in new ventures and all of that. Is that an exciting enough story for someone like you, as you're looking?
Let me see if I can slightly reframe this, because I think we're trapped in a conversation about growth, which is yesterday's conversation. And I think we're ignoring what the military is telling us about security. And what they're telling us is the number one issue facing militaries from a security standpoint is indeed the collapse of ecosystems. And the US military, the Dutch military, the Chinese, I don't know about the Indians, but others have all put this at the top of their agenda. And we seem to be talking about growth in a material way, which is increasingly no longer possible. So as an entrepreneur, how does this all play out? And how does it play out in Southeast Asia? We are going to have to shift our models. So let's take India. The next green revolution will not look like the last one. But without that next green revolution, there is no future for the farmers. There is no future for India's ability to feed itself securely, etc. All these things play out. So where's the opportunity? We've seen in the West in the last few years, absent government regulation, absent a real care for climate change, the rise of plant-based protein, alternative to meat. You'd think that India would be a leader in this area. Take millet as a source of protein. It's drought resistant. It can help work with the tribal farmers, but it needs technology, it needs markets, it needs exposure. These are the opportunities that have to be grasped. The incumbents, unless they make the journey, are going to rapidly see that the financial markets will not reward the status quo, whether it's the rating agencies or the capital. A third of all global capital under management will be measured for impact by 2025. So how does this play out on the ground? So I was speaking to the innovation minister in Canada recently, and he was very proud of public policy that has led to about $2 billion a year coming into venture capital in Canada. That's a great achievement. What he didn't realize is that in Southeast Asia, there's $6 billion in venture capital going into innovation. It's not China, it's not India, and it's not all food delivery. People are innovating to enable the bottom of the pyramid to have a decent standard of living so that they can be part of the consumer economy. This is what major industrial houses are doing in Indonesia and elsewhere. And so they're looking for global technology that can provide people with the means to feed themselves, power themselves in a way that's consistent with a planet worth living on. And I think this, again, is not being captured in the conversation as we try and force feed the economy with traditional notions of material growth.
Sure. Thanks for that. We'll pick that up in the last segment as well. Again, Viral, back to you. You've already kind of fleshed out and given us a perspective of how you see inflation as a big risk going forward, and central bankers and governments really struggling to deal with it because the policy responses are perhaps muted, and it's difficult to rein that in. How would you kind of look at the whole issue of global recovery? Because I mean, there's obviously concern that the pandemic isn't going away in a hurry. So how do you kind of decode what to expect?
Yes, so I'll come back to one theme I touched upon early on. Maybe it's a bit speculative, maybe it's perhaps deliberately controversially put, which is, are the advanced economies looking more and more like what we used to think of emerging markets or developing economies? And where I'm coming from is the following, which is, I thought that COVID shock, the climate change and the sustainable growth requirements that most people at least agree upon, even if there's disagreement on how to go about it. I thought all of these were likely to give us a pause to slow down a little bit as far as being desperate for short-term growth is concerned. I thought we were going to focus on the notion of sustainable growth, growth over a long period of time, growth which is not being manufactured in a fashion where we have too much consumption today, but we are going to leave with too much debt for the future generations to pay on the government balance sheets, etc. But somehow, within a period of 18 months, we have quickly come back to the same old thing of growth is low right now, growth can't be low right now, growth has to be resurrected at all costs to be high in the short run itself. And this is what I always thought was an emerging market tendency, where the potential to unlock growth is very high through structural reforms, through transitions to better ways of doing things, to more productive ways of doing things. In the newer debate, as Nick was highlighting, to more sustainable, green, cleaner ways of doing things. And yet we have actually stimulated so much the global economy through both monetary and fiscal stimulus. I understand the COVID shock was very, very large. But I see a pattern here of growth desperation, which is not of growth aspirations, but of growth desperation, which is that we are essentially unable to accept even mild shocks to growth for any period of time. And I think this growth desperation, in my view, comes from partly politics. There's always sort of politics involved in the messaging around short-term growth numbers. But I think it also comes from the very high levels of debt that everyone has taken on. Because if you have, the world is now powering in terms of overall social debt at something like 225 or 250% of GDP. Public debt out of that is a humongous component. The developing country debt has surpassed its historic levels when scaled by GDP. The developed countries have also surpassed their World War II levels of debt to GDP as far as the sort of mounted loads of debt is concerned. And in an environment like that, low growth for a period of time becomes very hard to accept because debt dynamics don't look very promising in future unless you have a credible way of resurrecting growth down the line. And of course, inflation is rising at the same time, which means central banks, at least under their mandates, would be required to raise interest rates. The whole idea is that it will pull down the long-term inflation, but of course, it may increase the short-term borrowing costs in the meantime. Again, this is going to be politically unpopular.
Yes.
So I think it's going to be very interesting, in my view, to see how the governments respond. Will they let their central banks actually raise interest rates? Maybe for a while, inflation could be politically unpopular. Maybe when a midterm election is coming up, you don't like it, but soon after you are happy to wing it on inflation and say, no, resurrect growth for me again. Will the central bankers be able to withstand those kinds of pressures? I thought it was extraordinary that all of last year, in spite of statistics hinting the other way, the world was told that this inflation is transitory. I don't know on what basis that those claims were made. I thought we had to slow down a little bit earlier than the central banks did. I have no doubt that some conversations were being held on when the treasuries in the United States had to be rolled over and what were the challenges of doing that. So let me, maybe it's a bit amorphous an idea right now, but my sense is that when you observe United States and Europe especially, but maybe even some of the other developed economies, that over a period of time, they are behaving just like emerging markets used to behave. Focus is on short-term growth, throw debt, print money at the problem, try and get a demand boost, see if you can get the growth virtuous cycle to start without necessarily much attention being paid to health, education, and infrastructure, which I thought were the core things one needed to actually generate growth in the long run. And now I would, along the lines of what Nick was saying, I would add sort of sustainable aspects. But again, I think if health, education, and infrastructure are good, I think you can generate sustainable growth without actually having to erode sort of climate and earth along the way. So, and I think I'll give you some interesting statistics of this. I've been observing economics research and its topics evolve over the last decade in the US academia. And, there's one definition of emerging markets by Ian Bremmer, I think, if I'm correct in attributing it to him, that I like a lot, which is an emerging market is one where 50% of everything is determined by politics. If I expand that a little bit more to sort of regulation rather than just politics, so, include central bank and other regulatory apparatus in it. Increasingly, research on developed economies is all about the Fed. It's all about the politics. It's all about public policy. And to me, this is a sign that we are transitioning developed economies into a setting where they are no longer remaining very market-based economies. They are no longer remaining sort of societies where regulation and governments enable companies to do what they could be best at doing and allow them to then compete on a level footing. There's a lot of financial repression in terms of extraordinarily low rates on savings so that everyone can borrow and demand can be kickstarted through that stimulus. So yeah, it's very interesting for me. As I said, these are some amorphous thoughts, but I wonder if we have somehow converged, but with not necessarily emerging markets rising to the levels of quality of institutions that developed economies had, but a gradual erosion down in the developed economies of their health, education, infrastructure, and institutions that support them a bit down. And this convergence has somehow happened with somehow the world having been left with 250% of debt to GDP ratio, and that worries me a lot. But let me stop there.
No, that's
and as I was saying, I think I see the inflation as actually a harbinger, or like a canary in the coal mine, sort of a warning that somehow demand is pushing too hard relative to what the world can supply, to what other transitions are taking place on climate front, on geopolitical front, on diversification of supply chains front, that the world is trying too hard on the demand front to push it at all levels against a supply which is not yet ready to adjust. And I think the inflation may be a sign that you need to slow down, you need to focus on longer term and sustainable growth. Don't push so much to get things done in the short run.
You make that point very well. The whole short-termism, too much focus on demand stimulation, and not enough understanding of why investment demand continues to be tepid. It is a fact that companies aren't investing in new capacity. Perhaps they don't see enough scope to really expand. And maybe that's an old paradigm. I don't know. It's hard to guess why that has been still so constrained. And is it largely a shock of what we saw in terms of digital transformation across economies and old economy companies who built factories, built plants and distribution networks, not being able to adjust quickly enough? Because I don't know if any of the panelists have a point of view on that. We'd love to hear. Do you see a schism between the old and the new parts of the economy?
Yeah, I think maybe I should let others comment, and then if there is time, you can come back to me.
Sure. Kanti, Nick, anyone?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to hop in here. Let's continue this theme of go metaphorically. I would say that we're liquidating the asset but calling it income, and I'm talking about planet Earth here. We're using 1.6 times the Earth's annual regenerative capacity. This cannot hold. It has to change, and hence the trepidation is entirely rational, because we need to change course. And I think that in 2022, to get granular, this will start to play out in that we will see less fiscal stimulus as governments run out of a runway here. What we're going to see is much more non-fiscal measures that drive us in the right place. And I think the capital markets are going to actually take over and drive the bus. And increasingly, it will be less governments and more the check writers who are going to determine which way we go. And they're going to be looking for resilience in companies. There's now a price on that. As we worry about supply chain shocks or extreme weather events or whatever, resilience has a price. But up until now, for the last 200 years, we valued efficiency. And so how these things get priced, I think, will determine a lot of things, including how we price government debt.
Got it. Interesting. Anyone wants to kind of build on what Nick said? And before that, Viral, Kanti, and then Sundeep.
I was just going to say that the kind of growth sort of ambitions of the developed countries, and that they're getting stuck on it, like Vera was saying. I mean, to go back to the geopolitics, when you see China growing at whatever it is, 14% per annum for 25 years or some such, I mean, I think, the issue of keeping up with China means that, these countries in the West suddenly feel that 2-3% growth rates or less over a secular period of time just won't do. And for security reasons, geopolitical reasons, they're not. I mean, I agree that we're heading towards a kind of planetary catastrophe. I was just reading Amitav Ghosh's new book, where he so passionately makes the case for less may be better, and being mindful of of the limits of the planet and trying to live within that, which would be the biggest economic kind of challenge, because how do you gear down a global economy geared towards growth, and all the macro stuff associated with that, employment, et cetera, to some steady state which is sustainable, which is mindful of climate change, when at the same time, I mean, there are obviously hundreds of millions of people still in poverty. I suppose the answer is some sort of green economy picks up the slack, and I guess Nick and others would tell us more about that. But that somehow is never quite taken off as an idea and a process, although I suppose I take Nick's point well that may be coming. Okay,
great. Sundeep?
Yeah, Indrajit, I think what Viral said raises a very fundamental question. That the very idea of growth, or to have growth as the objective itself, is not sustainable, which is different from the pursuit of sustainable development and sustainable growth. But just to have economic growth and look at it as a short-term objective to be extended is simply not going to happen for more than a decade or two. And somewhere the world is going to hit the Titanic. Now, if you look at the last 20 years, what has happened? I heard the Barbados Prime Minister addressing some audience, and she said that $25 trillion were spent on monetary easing. Now, if this figure is correct, $25 trillion on monetary easing. And I have found out my own study that almost $25 trillion were spent in the last 20 years on military expenditure. So $25 trillion on monetary easing and $25 trillion on military easing, the world has simply got addicted to these expenditures. Now, if you want to reinvent growth, what are you going to do about these addictions? Are the countries going to be able to give up monetary easing every time there is a crisis, including the current crisis of pandemic, which we have not really totally recovered? And the biggest elephant in the room is that our country is going to give up on the military expenditure, or they going to pump in that money, which is not really exactly productive expenditure. So you have again a paradox that you have a compulsion to spend this money. On the other hand, you have very natural constraints on growth, as Viral and Nick pointed out. And what are you going to have is a very rocky road ahead. And that will have social implications within the countries and geopolitical implications on the global stage. And I don't see how, if we go on the path that Viral has painted, that puts very significant constraints on growth in a very natural way, I don't see how we are going to avoid a world of turbulence in 10 to 20 years from now.
Fair enough. I know we're about 7 minutes away. Nick, we'd also need to kind of move towards closure. Is there anything specific that you'd like to point out on the sustainability issue that we ought to take cognizance before we start the last
I'd love to hop in with two things here very quickly. I think we're talking about material growth, not growth. And I'd love to illustrate this by what happened during COVID, at least the first wave in India, where everybody left the cities and made this difficult journey back to their villages and so on. And, the assumptions have been that, India and elsewhere will follow the traditional patterns of development and including urbanization. And I think we could see reverse urbanization. So if we're looking at resilience and technology and new economics, what does new technology enable us to do? Well, you can do many things in the village that historically you could only do in the city. Access to healthcare, education, and so on. And even with distributed power, solar, you can do all kinds of things in the village. So the advantages of slumming it in the city, as it were, whether you're aspiring middle class or just a laborer, are rapidly diminishing, particularly if we're expecting to live with pandemics. Now, this takes us into more romantic notions of Indian development that go back to time of independence, but perhaps the future is arriving, that actually those original ideas of small is beautiful, harnessed to exponential fourth industrial revolution technologies, enable us to do things radically differently. Well, that has huge implications for infrastructure, innovation, deployment of these innovations, and who owns them and how you finance that. But I think the opportunities are there, and with fintech and other innovations coming out of India and elsewhere, I think there's a model here that enable people to survive what is inevitable now over the next 50 years as we come to terms with the fact that we're in the Anthropocene era, and we have to drive a very different way of improving our lives and living together on this small planet. I think that can play out in India. In fact, I think India is the petri dish for this and has all the ingredients and incentives to play this role. So I predict in 2022, we start the process of reverse urbanization, and this will play out across emerging Asia and elsewhere.
Very interesting. Reverse urbanization. Thanks for that, Nick. What we do now is, with the help of the panel, try and kind of, based on all that we've heard in the course of these little less than 90 minutes, if each of you could pick one theme or one idea or something that gives us scope to reflect and pause and reflect going forward in 2022, something that you've heard the rest of the panel talk about, which stayed with you, it will be useful. Starting with you, Viral, anything that struck you as interesting, that gave you pause for reflection that you'd like to share?
Yes, I think a lot of us seem to agree on a notion of more stable growth, maybe both in terms of climate sustainability as well as sort of financial stability. And maybe I just want to end on a positive note here that maybe technology offers ways of making this achievable. I would focus especially on education. I think by construction, if you focus on pre-primary, primary sort of school education, it's an investment in the long run. It's not something that's going to pay off rewards immediately. Strange as it might seem, I think it's almost as important in developed economies such as the United States as it is in parts of India. And I think universalization of broadband, what can be achieved through digital apps, what can be achieved through, Khan Academy on YouTube being sort of available to everyone. I think there's tremendous potential here. And I would say that maybe investments of these type that don't get as much focus when we are thinking of big problems of the world, that maybe this is sort of the need of the hour.
Sure.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks so much on that, the power of technology to solve complex societal challenges. Kanti, coming to you, any one idea that stayed with you?
I think actually Nick's last point about reverse urbanization struck me. In the India-China book that I strategically placed there so you could kind of see it, I ended with this thought that, you can't build it ends with the meditation of how much more advanced China is and all of that, and India kind of needs to catch up. And one of the things I say is you can't build a great bar on a largely rural society, which is what India still is. But I think his remark made me think about that. I mean, whether there's, leave aside the India-China competition, but whether, and I'm not entranced by village life. I mean, for sociological reasons, they seem to be dens of horrible caste and other kinds of inequities and stuff. But his vision there, I think, made me think that there may be the modern village might not be that. Could be something very different. Could be the molecular structure, not quite a Gandhian republic, but a structure which could, mean a completely different politics, civilization, and eco-civilization, as you said. So I think that's going to stay with me the most. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Sundeep?
Well, whether it is inflation that Viral talked about in his opening comment, or whether it is vaccination that Kanti talked about in the opening comments, all of those could be the toolkit of the devil of inequality. Inflation can create massive inequality. It will not affect some people and it will damage some people. And vaccines are providing solutions, but they are also creating a massive inequality. So the message I take home is that the challenge of inequality has to be addressed, that we have to work towards an inclusive world, not an equal world, but an inclusive and equitable world. And now the path to that equitable world can come from education, as Viral mentioned, can come from a modern village that Nick mentioned, can come from regional cooperation that Kanti mentioned. There can be many tools, but our overall objective has to be a world where everybody has a place to stay and grow in a very positive and sustainable way.
Great. So well put. Thank you, Sundeep. Nick, we're almost on time, but
okay.
Please share your thoughts.
Well, I've been delighted to be part of this and share. I think what I take away from this is that we each come at this from very different angles, and we need a more comprehensive and sort of inclusive understanding of things, and all the different elements that have been brought up today are vital. And yet we all tend to work on one axis, and we need to see the secular and the sustainable in the sort of same branch. But I think what I'm seeing is the divide between incumbents and insurgents. And we need many more conversations that bring the two together, and so that we find a way through this, not so much transition, but I think what I'm hearing today is transformation.
Terrific. And that's music to our ears, because Founding Fuel is placed at as a bridge between incumbents and insurgents. That's how we see ourselves, because otherwise there's often very little conversation between the two, and things don't move forward in the way that they should. And at this stage, really like to thank the panel. I think for some of the really valuable perspectives that you've left us with, and the point that Nick you just made, which is that with this whole multidisciplinary lens that these conversations bring about, is a useful way to force us to think a little differently, because we get siloed, we get too narrow in our thinking, and all of you, economists, global experts on security, geopolitics, you yourself, Nick, as a sustainability expert, bring very rich perspectives. And when you meld that together, you get a much richer tapestry of ideas. That was the intent. And our audience, I'm guessing, will tell us whether it worked or not. We've asked them, I think, on the chat to leave some feedback, which we'll share with the panel as well. But really, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting all the four of you. We're delighted that you accepted the invitation and we could have a stimulating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Inderjit.
Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, IG. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.